Bienvenidas a todas. We are so excited to have you here to join us for the first of the America's Research Network, or ARENET, of our online talks, and the first in our series, Iberian Borderlands in Cyberspace. I am Catherine Tracy Goode, Tracy to my friends and colleagues, the director of the Tools for Researchers program at ARENET, and I'm pleased to be with you here today. Last fall, one of ARENET's biggest projects came to fruition when the Oxford Handbook of Borderlands of the Iberian World was published. The volume is a state of the field on borderlands and frontiers across the Spanish and Portuguese colonial worlds, from North and South America to Asia, with 34 essays and 40 authors. Today, we are thrilled to have the co-editors Cynthia Radding and Danna Levin Rojo, who are also ARENET board members, to start the Iberian Borderlands in Cyberspace series with an introduction to the volume to discuss the background on the process of the project, as well as an overview of the contents. Before I introduce them, please stay tuned to our social media accounts for information on the next presentations in the Iberian Borderlands in Cyberspace series, where we will be featuring authors from the volume talking about their individual chapters. Now, let me introduce Cynthia Radding and Danna Levin Rojo. Cynthia Radding is the Guggenheim Distinguished Professor of History and Latin American Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the chair of the ARENET Board of Directors. She has published extensively on Latin American colonial history with a focus on the intersections between environmental and ethnographic history. Her scholarship is rooted in the imperial borderlands of the Spanish and Portuguese American empires, emphasizing the role of indigenous peoples and other colonized groups in shaping these borderlands, transforming their landscapes, and producing colonial societies. Amongst her many publications are two books: Wandering Peoples, Colonialism, Ethnic Spaces, and Ecological Frontiers in Northwestern Mexico, 1700 to 1850, and Landscapes of Power and Identity, Comparative Histories in the Sonoran Desert and the Forest of Amazonia from Colony to Republic. Danna Levin Rojo is a full-time professor at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Azcapotzalco, UAM Azcapotzalco in Mexico City, and she is secretary of the ARENET Board of Directors. She is a historian and social anthropologist, and her main interests are Hispanic American colonial historiography, transculturation in colonial New Spain, and interethnic relations in the United States Southwest, with a particular emphasis on contemporary New Mexico. She has published many articles in journals and edited collections, and her book, Return to Aztlán, Indians, Spaniards, and the Invention of Nuevo Mexico, was published in 2014. And they are the co-editors of the volume, the Oxford Handbook of Borderlands of the Iberian World, that we are here to discuss today. And I should note that they also have individual chapters in the volume, and they'll be back with us to discuss those as part of the Iberian Borderlands in Cyberspace series. So, Danna and Cynthia, let's start at the beginning. Could you speak about the genesis of the project and why you thought a state of the field on the topic of borderlands was important to pursue?
Well, hello. I thank you, Tracy, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm very excited to talk about the process, very, very long process to make this book, which has been a very exciting experience, very rich. And well, I would like to start by saying that this book started to be, the project of the book started to be drafted by Cynthia and myself, and with the collaboration, by the way, of other members of the ARENET board in the year 2012. But actually, this the idea came from other experiences of participating in previous seminars on particularly, or more specifically, the Spanish borderlands, northern New Spain, and the Gran Chichimeca and the US Southwest that Cynthia and I had been collaborating with for several years. And then in that project, which was called Las Vías del Noroeste, and was housed or sponsored by the Instituto de Investigaciones Antropológicas of UNAM in Mexico. Many topics came forth, and then the discussions were really interesting about precisely interethnic relations, about the impact of the environment in cultural creativity and cultural transformation, and then how the societies impact the environment and vice versa. And it was a project that lasted several years as well and had 3 books as a result. And then with that experience, Cynthia and I began talking about that it would be interesting really to expand these discussions to a wider geographic area, and particularly all of the Americas. And then we started to think of framing this new discussion, this new research experience on the framing it under the borderlands concept, rather than talk only about northern New Spain or the Spanish borderlands of the United States. We wanted to make a more comparative effort to really start to talk about other frontier regions in different parts of America, not only subjected to the Spanish colonial empire, but also to the Portuguese. And well, it was a very long process, but very rich. Then we started to draft these projects in 2012. We had lots of inputs from different colleagues. Susan Leeds, for instance, saw that first project and made several several comments and several suggestions. And so it began to grow. I don't know, Cynthia, if you remember, this was really a very interesting process. And then the project changed. It had several versions, preliminary versions, until we came to the last one. And then when you started to think about where would be possible or what printing house would be interesting for us to offer a book like that, a volume like that, and then you thought of the Oxford Handbook series because of the importance of these series. And well, maybe you remember something about that.
Yes, I'm very happy, Danna, to comment on this. The project took shape, as Danna has said, and in part from our experience with Vías del Noroeste. And I think that a project on borderlands really congealed with what had been a long-standing mission of the Americas Research Network, which began really with roots in the northern borderlands of Mexico. And the reason that we thought of the Oxford Handbook series is that in 2011, the Oxford Handbook series had published a handbook on Latin America, which is a very fine handbook. It's edited by Jose Moya at University of California, Los Angeles. But we noticed that in that handbook, it was somewhat traditionally organized. And there was no content, there were no chapters that specifically referred to either the borderlands of northern Mexico and North America, or the borderlands of South America, and there were no chapters in that handbook on the Caribbean. And that, I think, coupled with the fact that in those years, between 2010, 2012, it became very clear that the concept of borderlands was now a very dynamic concept that had really transcended what had been the early 20th century version of Borderlands that was quite Eurocentric and somewhat traditional. So I think our personal emphases of research, the strengths of the Americas Research Network, and the possibility of offering a very innovative volume to the Oxford Handbook series came together in our decision to undertake this project, which, as Danna has suggested, turned out to be much larger and a much longer project than we had at first envisioned, but we are thrilled with the product that now is before us.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that's an excellent segue to my next question, which was thinking about organizing a project of this size is so daunting. So I wondered if you all could talk some about the logistics, particularly about how you brought in institutions to help sponsor the project, but also choosing authors, thinking about the challenges that you faced in terms of coverage of the topic, the thematic, geographical, and temporal coverages. And I'm going to do a little screen share here so that we can see some of the sponsors of the project. But I will I'm turning the floor over to the two of you.
Well, I can begin on this one, and we do want very much to thank several universities. We'll just start with the Americas Research Network itself, which has provided very important logistical and economic support. CAORC, which is the Council of American Overseas Research Centers, to which ARENET belongs. CAORC also helped us with logistics and with some financial support, particularly for the two workshops that we held. CIESAS in Mexico, el Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Superiores en Antropología Social, played a very important role in sponsoring particularly the first workshop and in paying for some of the expenses of the authors to attend it. The Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Azcapotzalco, where Danna is a distinguished professor, provided very important support. And two of our authors have come from different campuses of the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana. The Mexican Consulate General in Raleigh, North Carolina, which covers both North and South Carolina, also provided very generous support for the second authors workshop that took place in Chapel Hill. And the then consul, Javier Diaz de Leon, gave a really marvelous talk at our keynote address in that conference. And then I do want to thank my own university, the University of North Carolina, through the College of Arts and Sciences, the Institute for the Study of the Americas, and the History Department that really very generously provided support for our second authors conference. We began to plan the book in three major parts. Part one begins with indigenous borderlands, cultural landscapes, and spheres of power in the Americas. Part two brings us into transcontinental borderlands in Iberoamerica. And part three then turns to imperial borderlands and transoceanic exchanges. We did not want to organize the book in geographical chunks. Rather, we organized it thematically with then a representation of the different regions within those themes. And in kind of a general sense, the book is organized chronologically. We cannot say that we have a universal coverage of the borderlands, but by calling it Iberian Borderlands, and I know that we'll get a little bit more into this in the actual content of our introduction, we wanted to take into account the imperial and indigenous spaces that overlapped, that were spaces of commingling and sharing, as well as spaces of conflict in both North and South America. And we also wanted to take into account the networks of commerce, of migration, of the movement of peoples through the fluvial spaces of the Caribbean, the Gulf of California, the Gulf of Mexico, and the great riverine systems of South America. We also have 3 chapters that specifically deal with the connections across the Pacific. One of them, of course, written by Catherine Tracy Goode. And so we have a very, geographically and temporally, we have a very expansive notion of borderlands. In terms of the organization, we didn't issue a general call for papers. Rather, we invited authors, in part through our knowledge, and of course, as people recommend other people. We invited authors, and over the course of, we had our first set of authors over the first 6 months, with which we sent the initial prospectus to Oxford University Press. And then we had a few adjustments, and we had the final set of authors by early 2015.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yes, I think I would like to add something about the particularity of this volume in relation to other collective works, and which is one of the, I think, is one of the virtues of this book. And it is, we didn't want it to be like, okay, let's make a colloquium or a congress or something, and then we'll publish the papers, the best papers that come through, then we'll publish them, and that's it. And that is one of the main reason why it took so long to make this volume, precisely because we wanted to be really authentically a collaborative effort, so that not everybody just wrote commission articles and everybody writes their own article just like that and that's it. We wanted it to be a project where we could really discuss with all the authors, have a common ground of topics and of perspectives somehow. So we wanted to work it, make it an outcome of a sort of seminar, and that's why we had these 2 authors' colloquiums at different moments to discuss different versions of the papers, like first version, second versions, and then discuss all together all these things. And therefore, we wanted to work with we decided to make an outline beforehand of the kind of issues we wanted to be discussed in this volume. And then when we contacted the authors, as Cynthia says, first starting with the authors or the researchers we knew already, and then following the recommendations of others, we sent this idea of, okay, we want a book on these topics, and we would like you to write, because we know your work on this or that particular issue, we would like you to propose to us a chapter dealing with that region or that particular problem you have been researching. So authors made their own proposals within general framework that we first proposed, and then they made their own specific proposal, saying, okay, well, I want to propose a chapter, yes, say something on Amazonia, but focused on this or that issue. And that's how we went about. And I think that was very, very interesting way of working, because it allowed us to have a final volume where we would make not only a state of the art, which was something important for us, and also it is important for the Oxford series of handbooks, but we could also offer original research, new original research on a wide variety of topics, from, I don't know, forced labor and indigenous slavery, like in Andrés Reséndez's chapter, or on the encounter of Russians and Spaniards in the North Pacific, like with Marta Ortega's chapter. So we sort of just said, okay, our general idea of the book is this, and we want to cover this and this and these areas and this and this and these periods, and we know you work on this region and on this period. What would you like to offer? How would you like to participate in a project like this? And I think that was great.
If I may add, Tracy, another thing that I think we are all very excited about in terms of the book, in terms of the book's content and its final architecture, is that while we do have a very strong emphasis on the geopolitical, spatial contours of borderlands, clearly the indigenous population that is, and cultures that are in this book throughout, we also have a lot of strength on the different facets of economy in these Iberian borderlands. But we also have really wonderful contributions on art, music, science, so that we brought out these cultural aspects of the borderlands as part of what was really the fullest sense of the Iberian imperial worlds.
Absolutely. As an author in the volume, I think one of the things that was most helpful in the process of putting together a chapter in this was that you brought the authors together twice so that we had the opportunity to workshop our chapters. How important was it to bring the authors together for these international authors conferences, and what do you think brought, what do you think that brought to the overall project? And again, I'm going to screen share because we have some fun photos from the two authors conferences. So we'll be screen sharing for a little bit while the two of you are talking.
I don't know. Well, I can start with this. I think it was very, very important to bring the authors together, and we were very fortunate actually that most of them could indeed attend both conferences. I think maybe there was one here, one that didn't come to the first, or another that didn't come to the second, but basically we were all there in both conferences, and it was really, really important because we could discuss, try to find common grounds and also discuss our differences. And the way we organized these was not as presentations, it was not really colloquium to present papers as in a conference where one makes the research and then presents a finished paper. What we did was we pre-circulated the first versions of the chapters of everybody, which were in different states of finishing. I don't know if you say it that way. Some were more finished, others were less finished, but we circulated them among all the authors, and so we read them beforehand. So when we arrived to the colloquiums, we had all read the work of the others, and then we organized six, I don't remember if they were like 5 or 6 workshops where the authors would discuss papers that would have something to, that would share certain topics, but they had pre-read the articles, so there was no reading of the articles or no reading of papers in the workshops. It was really just discussion about things we had already read beforehand, and I think this was very, very important because we could get to a very deep discussion, and some authors were suggesting others, making criticisms or adding, suggesting new sources or suggesting new perspectives or questioning certain points in their papers. And I think this was really, really important for the final result of the book. And then the second colloquium, we discussed almost final versions of the whole chapters. Yeah, I don't know, Cynthia, if you would like to add something.
Yes, I'll be happy to add. Thank you so much for that explanation. I think that these workshops were very important on two levels. One was we really formed a community. The authors came to know one another. We were working across basically three languages, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. And secondly, as Danna has emphasized, these were not symposia with the formal reading of papers. Rather, they really were workshops, and we all worked. We divided the authors into groups, and in the groups that were clustered around themes, the authors were committed to reading each other's papers in that workshop and then attending the other workshops over a period of about 2.5 days. And so that's the second value of it, that people really did get constructive criticism and a very comfortable environment about how to complete their chapters, how to rewrite in some cases, or re-edit, I should say. And a third important component of this is how all of us authors began to see the interrelation of themes across chapters, and it helped us very much as editors in the final organization of the book. And if I may say, as a fourth benefit of this, as you can see in both of these, the first set of photographs was from the first workshop in Mexico City, in Ciesas, and in Guam, Azcapotzalco, and the second one at the University of North Carolina. It was an opportunity also to make this known to a public. And we had a public session in each of these workshops that was intended for a student audience that talked about issues relating to borderlands, relating to migration in both historical and contemporary periods.
Okay, excellent. And again, as an author in the volume, I thought that the bringing us together in the colloquiums was really invaluable. Both, I think, to be able to get to know other people in the project, but also, I think, as you said, Cynthia, to see where our individual chapters fit in the larger picture was particularly useful. And speaking of the larger picture, part of what the two of you have done as editors is create an introduction to the entire volume that lays a foundation for the rest of the chapters. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about what the process of working together to craft the introductory chapter was like, and especially as you were grappling with some of these key terms like borderlands and frontiers, and how best to, again, lay that foundation for the rest of the volume.
I would like to say about that, emphasize what Cynthia just mentioned about the colloquiums being important for the organization, final organization of the volume, and then the writing of the introduction. Because I just wanted to add, for instance, we had proposed a time table of content, or to organize the chapters in a certain way. And then after the second colloquium, we realized, well, you know something, it seems like after all these discussions that this chapter has more to do with this other one. And then we regrouped the chapters differently. I mean, not entirely differently, but there was, we moved the chapters around, and then the time, you don't say timetable, the table of content, the index came to be different. And then for writing the introduction, this was invaluable because we could see, I mean, we wanted to make of this introduction, and also this is one of the requirements of the press, but we also wanted to do it this way, not to make a description of each of the chapters, but rather to provide the frame, general frame, conceptual frame for what it means, what we understand as borderlands, what is it, the difference between a borderland and a frontier, And, you know, why talk about Iberian empires, why we chose the scope, this geographic scope for the book. And of course, these would have been much more difficult if we hadn't had all these discussions with the authors, where we could see how things related together and how everyone understood Borderlands. So yeah, and I think for me to work with Cynthia on this level was really exciting and really, I'm sorry, I don't know if you say enriching, because I could learn a lot. And then I think it was very easy to work with Cynthia. You know, it's like we would meet here in Mexico or there in North Carolina, and then have discussions about what we thought. And then the other thing we didn't want to do was, okay, you write this half, I write this half, and that's it. We wanted to be an integrated text. So we discussed basically our notions of borderlands, our notions of frontier, what authors we wanted to refer to as, I don't know how you say that in English, sorry. Well, what authors we wanted to base our discussion on. And I think an important thing about this idea of borderlands we are presenting, I mean, it's not that nobody has thought about it before, of course, but is that borderlands are these, Cynthia said it already, borderlands are these spaces of contestation, but also spaces of commingling and cultural admixture, spaces of conflict, and that we should not think of borderlands only in terms of the relation between center and periphery, but as in a different way. And also, we didn't want the volume and that to be only about, you know, geographic areas that are adjacent to demarcation lines between political entities or political states, because that is valid basically, that perspective would be valid basically only for 19th or 20th century phenomena, or 19th and 20th century history, but it's not necessarily applicable for the colonial period. And so for us, it was also important to talk about borderlands as these spaces that are maybe not only in relation to the demarcation lines or the spaces contested between these 2 or 3 imperial powers, like, you know, areas that are contested between Portugal and Spain, or Spain and France, or Spain and Russia, but also what some authors have called internal frontiers, which is or internal borderlands maybe, which would be all these areas where indigenous peoples with different cultures coexist. And I think that was a challenge as well. And we tried to talk about it in the introduction, how you talk about borderlands in relation to indigenous peoples, because that is very different as when you would talk about borderlands in relation to European or Euro-American modern entities.
Thank you, Danna. I can add to that just briefly. I do also want to say it's just been a wonderful experience working with you. And one of the blessings of this whole project is the way our friendship has deepened and become enriched. And I learned so much from you. And I agree with you that we also learned from our authors. And several of the authors had written some very interesting ideas in the introductions to their individual chapters, setting out how they see borderlands. And we were able to work some of this into the introduction to the entire volume. The introduction, we did really work together on all of it. And as Danna said, this was one of the important requirements that Oxford University Press made of us, that the introduction be slightly longer than the other chapters and be a very strong presentation of the major ideas of the book. It is in a way divided into two parts. The first part does cover the conceptual ideas and the expanding conceptual framework for the notions of borderlands, frontier, frontera, frontera, and how these have different meanings in the different languages and the different national traditions. And then the second half is kind of an historiography, a history of the idea of borderlands. And I remember as we were working together on it, we realized we hadn't quite planned it. We also did we brought history into that historiography through the ways that not an entire history, but the ways that Spaniards and Portuguese initially approached the Americas and the responses and ongoing cultures of the indigenous peoples. And I will add that another very important components of this are the Afro-descendant populations that are very strongly represented in the chapters in the book on the Caribbean as well as Brazil, and also the Asian migrants and the commercial connections to Greater Asia. And we also are very fortunate to have a very interesting, very important chapter, I think, on Portuguese India and the intellectual and scientific history of that imperial borderland.
Yeah, and can I add something? I mean, now that you mention it, I think it was really a good idea that you came up with about precisely adding to the introduction this section based on colonial sources that would convey a sense of what borderlands were for the Spaniards and for the Portuguese in their own discourse, say, through the sources, rather than only talk about academic perspectives on borderlands, in modern scholarship. And so it was very nice when you came up with this idea to have this small section that the introduction then also contains, which is on Cabeza de Vaca and Villagra and Gaspar Pérez de Villagra and I think
Jean de Lery, yes, on these 4 chronicles, yes.
Alonso de Ercilla, these chroniclers. And so I think it was, in the end, it is an introduction that covers a wide variety of literature, from the colonial sources to the some 19th century first scholars dealing with the topic, and then 20th century and 21st century scholarship, and also geographically very temporally and geographically very wide in coverage as an introduction.
Excellent. Thank you so much. My next question, this will be the last question, and then we're going to open it up to a couple of the other authors that were involved in the project as well. But the volume was released both as a digital resource and a printed hard copy of the book. And for those of you who haven't bought it yet, it looks like this. It is a massive tome, but full of incredibly interesting chapters. But I wondered if you all could speak about the challenges and benefits of publishing as an online book versus the hard copy, but then the hard copy came out about a month later after the digital version.
I would like to say something really short about that. I think it is a very good idea to have an online publication because it can reach to a very much wider audience. But also it has some um, inconvenient. Well, I don't know if say there were problems, but there was something we had planned from the beginning was to have, because it is so large, the book, we had planned to have one single bibliography, because then we realized, okay, bibliographies are going to be repeated. Many of the references will be used by 2 or 3 or 4 authors, or even, or more. And then this will make something like unfeasible. And then we thought it would be useful to have one single bibliography at the end of the volume, maybe similar as they do it in the Handbook of North American Indians or Handbook of Middle American Indians. I can't remember the printing house, these classical collections. And because that would be I don't know, useful for readers, instead of having each chapter followed by its own bibliography. But then with the digital version, the chapters, the other possibility with the digital version is that chapters can be sold separately. You don't have to sell the whole volume together or complete. And I think this was one of the reasons why the press also wanted to have it this way. But then this became a problem with this idea, or for this idea of having one single bibliography. And it was difficult to do that, because then you couldn't have full bibliographies for each chapter, because then the volume would be so big. And so we had to make some negotiations and adjustments there to be able to have, short bibliographies for each chapter. But then, that's the only thing I'm not happy with about the digital online version.
I'll just add a little bit to Danna's comments. And I think the question is so important, Tracy, because I think for authors today, and particularly younger authors who hopefully will be listening to this conversation, this is something that we all have to think about in terms of our publication. The fact that presses now are thinking much more in terms of the online market and presence for their books than the print version. And let me say that for me, and I think for all of us, the problem is not that the book is available both in electronic version and in print version. It's not a problem at all. The difficulties are what Danna was explaining, in that we had worked so hard through these two authors' colloquia, through the editing process in which we worked also individually with authors, to have a really thematically integrated book. And we found that the emphasis of Oxford University Press in wanting to be able to sell these chapters individually began to not break up, but began to weaken that unity. And the question of the bibliography that Danna has mentioned was one of these. And we're being rather diplomatic and really working on the whole. Working with Oxford University Press was a very professional, very good experience. But we did, we will reveal, we turned in the original complete manuscript in spring of 2017. And the book was not published until late November 2019, because the press began to look at word count differently, and many of the problems were not in the content of the chapters at all. It was in these nitty-gritty details the endnotes and the bibliography. And so this was simply a process that we had to work through. Danna and I did a lot of work on this, and we want to thank publicly all the authors who were just fabulous at getting back rewrites and making changes where these were requested in very rapid time. And I will say, I think there should be a prize created for the compilation of indices. Danna and I did the analytical index, and that's, I think, the product that we're the proudest of. So it's not an easy process. And I think we do have to think about these different environments in which books are books and individual author chapters, but in which books are now presented and sold. And it's I think something to take into account, because the electronic, there's no question, the digital environment is going to be the dominant environment probably, even though print books are not going to disappear or go out of style.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah,
and I have information about how to access both the hard copy version and the digital version that I'll put up at the very end of our talk right now. But first, we're very lucky that we have two of the other authors that are involved in the book, and I'm now going to include them in the discussion. Okay, Cecilia Sheridan de Ciesas Noroeste, ¿sí? Y Susana Dietz, Professor Emeritus from Northern Arizona University, who are both well-known and celebrated scholars who work on the northern borderlands of Mexico. See if you all would like to speak to your experience of being a part of this volume.
Okay, well, I would first of all like to say that this was an incredibly huge project for Cynthia and Danna to undertake. And although I had been involved in some of the initial discussions, I had decided I didn't really want to be an editor, and thank God for that, because it was a matter of years. And I think that what I'd like to say is that, first of all, working with the two editors was always something that worked out well. They were clear about what they needed. They were really responsive. The process of the colloquia, I think that is such a key part of how the book came to be organized, and also how it made me change how I was framing what I was planning to do in the particular article. I really came to see it as a chance to reflect on work that I had done over 20 years in terms of northern Mexico. And in the colloquia, the opportunity that we had to exchange ideas really helped me to focus in on what I thought was the most important thing about what I had studied for so many years, which I ended up calling the article Labyrinths of Mestizaje, which also my editors really forced me to define those terms. One of the things that the editors have talked about in terms of the overall themes of the book, I think it made me realize how I could not understand mestizaje, I could not understand ethnic relations without understanding gender. And that came out of, again, being in the colloquia and exchanging ideas with people and trying to clarify my ideas. So it was a long process, but I think the book is really pretty incredible, and I hope people will have a chance to look at many of the essays. Thank you.
Pasamos la palabra a Cecilia, sí.
Muchas gracias. Me parece que la intención es extraordinaria. Celebro la iniciativa de ARENET para crear esta serie, porque es un privilegio promover la lectura de un texto más allá de la escritura impresa. la posibilidad de comunicarse con los autores y con el libro en global, porque creo que es un libro que fue construido de manera global, pensando colectivamente, que es realmente una maravilla la creación del conocimiento desde esa perspectiva, abre un diálogo que va a enriquecer los textos y va a enriquecer lo que intentamos escribir en ellos o lo que pensamos que podría favorecer el conocimiento sobre esta dificultosa zona, área, espacio o tiempo de lo que han sido las fronteras en Iberoamérica. Pensaba también en la importancia del texto y su difusión, porque lo considero un parteaguas de este conocimiento y de esta necesidad de repensar cada día lo que hacemos y lo que creamos. Así que celebro la iniciativa, repito, y agradezco, por supuesto, a las dos editoras del libro, a las que les deseo lo mejor en esto, porque fue un trabajo de locos. Así que, pues, un aplauso y veamos cómo se va dando la serie a lo largo del tiempo y la posibilidad de abrir espacios de intercomunicación con los lectores del libro. Gracias.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias.
Okay, could I just say one other little thing that occurred to me about this? I think the other thing that this whole process of the book made me realize is that for many years, I felt like I worked on a periphery, and that there were a lot of jokes about how my work was peripheral, I was peripheral. And what this whole process did was make everyone understand how not peripheral Borderlands as it's envisioned in this volume actually is. So that was an incredibly it was an experience that made me understand the field in which I had worked so much differently than before.
Absolutely, I think, and as an author, I think that that's one of the things that's most important about this volume is that the idea that Borderlands are somehow peripheral when actually they are so central to the functioning of Spanish and Portuguese empires, and to bring together so many scholars who can bring different perspectives from these different borderlands really demonstrates that point quite nicely. And right now, the only thing I would like to say about my chapter is that Danna and Cynthia did a Herculean effort with my chapter because I had more footnotes than any other author in the entire volume and had to cut quite a few of them, as well as massive footnotes of a huge amount of historiography, and working through that to prioritize what needed to be in my chapter and what I could let go of was again a Herculean effort on their part. So I would like to, we're going to close our talk now. I'd like to especially thank Cynthia Radding and Danna Levin Rojo for their participation and insights into publishing the volume, the Oxford Handbook of the Oxford Handbook of Borderlands of the Iberian World. And I'm going to do a screen share now so you can see information on accessing the volume. Both you can buy it through Amazon Smile, and the Americas Research Network will receive donations for each copy sold, or you can access the digital version of the volume through your institutional subscription to the Oxford. Okay, and I'd also like to invite you to stay tuned for more from the series Iberian Borderlands in Cyberspace in the coming weeks and months, and really into 2021. So both Susan Deeds and Cecilia Sheridan, as well as our co-editors, will be presenting individually on their works, and as well as myself, will be having lots of individual presentations from the authors to learn more about the content of the volume. And with that, I'd like to say a massive thank you. I'd also like to thank the person behind the scenes in all of this, the executive director of the Americas Research Network, Greta de Leon, who is helping manage the technical side of this. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event.